Um, if you, there are some little handout pages if you didn't grab one off the back table there at the back, I believe. If you need one of those. And for some reason, when this printed tonight, it printed sideways. So if I seem like I'm not going the right direction, my papers are all out of whack. So, whoops, and then that won't sit there. Okay, I think I'm all organized here. We will be in Isaiah chapter 5 tonight. So hopefully if you were here last week and remembered the reading assignment, that's the assignment for tonight was to read Isaiah chapter 5. And of course we'll read through it as we're studying the text as well. But if you read it ahead of time, then you have a little idea of where we're going and some of the things that we'll be talking about. So hopefully that'll facilitate our discussions a little bit. The two visions that are referenced there are, if you recall some of the things that we've been talking about, and we'll hit the review here in a minute, but there were two visions portrayed in these first 5 chapters of Isaiah. God's ideal vision of what life would be like in Jerusalem if things went according to his plan, and then the vision of what things really were like because the people did not follow God's plan. And so the two visions that are represented here are those kind of that ideal that we've talked about versus the actual reality of the way things are. And so that's going to kind of come to a head tonight. We're going to kind of wrap up that part of the book as we've been looking at kind of this introductory chapters, and the two visions are going to kind of come to a conclusion tonight as we get ready to move on into new material next week. So tonight, our objectives are to be able to explain how God feels about the inequities of life in Jerusalem. We talked a lot about that last week with how people treated and mistreated one another, and how those that were the poorest and the least well-off in society bore an unfair burden of how things were in reality, and how the people who were well-off should have been treating those who were without. And we're going to see more of that tonight as well. We also want to be able to outline the kinds of behavior and thinking that God finds offensive. We're going to have a section of woes tonight where God is going to pronounce how he feels about things that are going on that he doesn't like. And then we want to be able to explain why God decides to discipline his people. The ultimate outcome of the way the people are living is that they're going to be disciplined. Why is it that God resorts to discipline, or that God brings about this discipline upon his people? The theme of this section has been what we just talked about. Isaiah 5 is going to complete that theme tonight, the opening section of Isaiah, in which the prophet explores the relationship between God and his people, and he presents the reality and the potential of that relationship. And it's that constant tension between what God really wants his relationship with his people to be versus the way the relationship ends up being because of the way the people behave and the way they act. So we just have this constant back and forth between the way God wants it and the way it really is. Quick review of the things that we've looked at up to this point. Isaiah 1 through 4 reveals those two views of Jerusalem, that glorious potential of what could be. And God is a dreamer, right? I mean, he has this vision of the way things could be and what he really wants to do to bless his people, to encourage them, to set them up with a wonderful kingdom to live in. But then we have the depressing reality of what actually is. And it's that way, not because of a failure on God's part or a failure of God to be able to deliver on what he wants to give them, but it's a failure on their part to live up to his expectations, to maintain that covenant relationship with him that he has called them into. And so we have that back and forth all the way through, and that vision for a healthy relationship in chapter 1 especially was presented to us as that father-son relationship, and you know, the potential that exists there within that father-son relationship of the father being the wise mentor and the guide, the educator, the leader that raises that son to walk in his footsteps, versus the rebellious son who has a father that is willing to give him all that but chooses to go his own way instead. And so even within those relationships, we have that potential versus reality playing back and forth with the father-son, where it should be a good relationship, but it's not. We have that potential of what should be a good relationship between a doctor and a patient, where the doctor has the knowledge and the ability to heal what is ailing the patient, but the patient ignores their treatment. And then we have that potential of a husband-wife relationship, where it should be the husband is that provider, is that protector, and the wife is the loving spouse, versus the reality of what their situation was, where God was that loving husband, but Israel was the adulterous wife. And then continuing through the chapters last week, we had, well, that's kind of a repeat. I've repeated those things on that slide. But then a community that cared for one another's needs was God's vision. That would be a community that showed honor for God's standards of righteousness and justice. But in reality, what we had was an upper class that did not help the lower class, and an upper class that used the military, economics, religion to cling to their power, when they should have been using those things to help the ones that were less fortunate, that were less well off. And so just that constant back and forth between here's what it should be versus here's how it is. And Isaiah just is hammering that over and over and over again through all the different illustrations and analogies and metaphors and all those things of the way he presents things. So tonight, here's where we're going. We're going to look at chapter 5 in 3 different sections. It's going to complete kind of this view of the way things, of the two views, the potential versus the reality. It's going to do it in 3 different sections. The first section is going to be a parable of a farmer and his vineyard. Then we're going to look at the middle section, which is longer, that has those 6 woes. And then the last section there has a metaphor of an invading army bringing God's discipline. So we'll look at those 3 sections tonight. So let's look first at Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 7. Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 7. And we'll just read that section and then see where we go from there. He says, "Let me sing now for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill, and he dug it all around, removed its stones, and planted it with the choicest vine. And he built a tower in the middle of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So now let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground. And I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I also will charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. Thus he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, a cry of distress." So here we have this parable of the vineyard, and if you're following along with your handouts there's the things that get filled in those on the blanks there in the handout. What is the purpose of this parable? Okay, to help the reader understand God's perspective. And so, so often when I'm thinking of when Jesus would tell a parable, or he would give some teaching, or he would kind of stand in opposition to the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees, and Jesus would do his thing and he would speak, and then there's kind of this moment of dawning recognition on the part of the Pharisees and the scribes. Hey, wait a minute. He's talking about us. We're the bad guys in this story, right? Whereas this moment of they don't really understand what Jesus is saying, and then they understand, and they're offended all of a sudden because they weren't expecting to be the bad guys. They've always viewed themselves as the good guys, right?
It's really no different today
Oh, sure.
When you're trying to reach out to somebody with the Word of God and through the Word of God, and they see something, and right away you can see the defense go up.
Yeah.
And then things start coming out of their mouths that will, that in defense and, yeah.
Right, yeah. I think it's, to some extent maybe human nature where we are naturally defensive about things at times. And if we feel that we're being attacked, or we feel that we're being judged in some way, a lot of times we just throw up those defenses without really considering whether or not that judgment or that those things that are being said really are true. And I think that happens a lot in the interactions Jesus had with the scribes and the Pharisees. But I think this is for that purpose, as we have Isaiah preaching these lessons, or these are being read, or however this information is being disseminated to the people. You have this upper class of society that he really, we talked about him last week at length, that he really is letting them have it for the way that they have mistreated the poor amongst them. But you can almost imagine them saying, wow, he's really mad at someone. I wonder who's doing such a bad job. I wonder, those people down the street, they really have got to get it figured out because they're not treating people right. And then, here's one more story where he lays out this parable, and then at the end of it, he just lays it out there, and he says, the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. Okay, well, he's identified that for us. And that choice vine, who is that? It's the men of Judah. Wait a minute. I'm a man of Judah. That's me he's talking about. He's saying that I'm the one that didn't produce the fruit that was supposed to be produced. Wait a minute. Let's go back and examine this. And so this parable is to help the people understand God's perspective. They looked at their material wealth and their power and the way things were going in a way that they thought was very well, and they looked at that as being evidence of the idea that God was supporting their decision, that God was supporting who they were, and the lifestyle that they were living. But they had it backwards. They had it all wrong. And Isaiah's, saying you're looking at the wrong evidence. God is not on your side. He's not supportive of the way that you're living. He's not looking kindly at the things that you're doing. And you've got to understand why that is. It's not just that God is fickle, or that he's mean, or that he has grown tired of you. It's because you're not living the way that he's calling you to live. And until you do, you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of things with God.
God's intention is always to bring us to repentance.
To
repentance.
To repentance, yes, absolutely. You're exactly right. And the purpose of this is to not alienate, not to hurt their feelings, not to drive them away. The purpose of this is to make them repent. Very often it does not have that effect, but that's the whole purpose here. So the purpose of this is to get the people to see things from God's perspective. The things that are going on here, it fit right in with the things that we've seen up to this point. We've seen, Isaiah call Israel a rebellious son. We've seen them call Israel an unfaithful wife, an uncooperative patient. And in this one, it just fits right in with that they are an unfruitful vine. They are an unproductive vine in a vineyard. And that fits right in with the illustrations that he's made up to that point. Isaiah here asks the listeners to pass judgment upon some things. If you look at verse 3, it says, "Now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard." So make a judgment over, where did this go wrong? God makes his defense in the first couple of verses, right? He says, let me tell you the story of my beloved concerning his vineyard. Let me tell you how it was on a fertile hill. I picked a choice spot. There's nothing wrong with the location of where this vineyard is. I took it and I prepared the land. I dug up the stones. There was no obstacles in the way of I planted it with the choicest vine. It was from good stock. There was nothing wrong with what was planted. He built a tower in the middle of it, and that was, a watchman's tower for the workers that would be able to look over it and make sure that they were always there on site to take care of it. He hewed out a wine vat. He prepared for the harvest. He expected a harvest. That's how sure he was of all the preparation and the work that he had done. Before there ever was a harvest, he prepared for it. He built a wine vat, and he was ready for that harvest to take place. And with all that in mind, he expected to receive fruit, but nothing. It produced only worthless fruit. And so now, judge between me and my vineyard. Was there any deficiency in what God had provided? No, he had done everything that he could do to provide for a proper harvest. And so where was the deficiency?
In the people.
It was in the vine, right? It was in it was in them and their ability to do what God had wanted them to do, or what God called them to do. Verse 4, what more was there to do for my vineyard that I could not have done? Well, what thing did I lack that if I had provided it would have made a difference? And there's nothing. There's nothing that you could point to that it would have made a difference like that. So God asks there for them to make a judgment, and he puts them in the position of judge, but they're judging over themselves. They're judging, have we done what we were supposed to do? It's a rhetorical question. It demands a specific answer, and there's only one way that it can be answered. So we see that parable play out in that way. Ultimately, the parable aims, he says here, to give God's rationale for the coming destruction of Jerusalem. In our society of law and order today, if somebody is accused of a crime, and everything goes the way the system is designed for, then they have their day in court, and they get to present their evidence, and then that judgment is pronounced. And then after judgment is pronounced, then we hear a sentencing. And it's that sentencing then comes in, and when they get carted off to jail, it's not a surprise at that point. Everybody knew the guilty verdict. Everybody saw the evidence. Everybody heard the pronouncement of judgment. They've heard the judge pronounce the sentence, and now it's time to go, right? So there's no surprise of it. And God here is basically doing that very thing. He's laying out his case, and he's by the end of the chapter, he's going to be talking about an invading army to come in and discipline them. And it shouldn't be a surprise when it finally happens, because we've seen the case presented. And so this is kind of that opening salvo of things that are being presented in this chapter to get us ready for the discipline that's coming later, the punishment that's coming because of their sins. And it's you can imagine if they're just living their lives as kind of the way they did, and all of a sudden an army shows up and wipes them out, they'd be saying, like, where'd that come from? Why did this army wipe us out? Well, now they know it's coming because God has prepared them for it because of their sins. All right, so that's that first section. Anything else there stand out that we want to cover on that? I sometimes get to going up here, and I forget to ask questions or give you guys a chance to jump in. Some of you aren't shy about it, but some of you, I want to make sure you have the chance to speak up if you want to.
I think the way he says my beloved or my beloved reminds me of the chapter before where he talks about my children.
Yes. That's the thing about, as I said in the introduction, God is a dreamer. God, if the people would do the right thing, God would salvage that ideal relationship with them. He would, despite all the times that they've messed up, God is not holding a grudge. He's not sending discipline because he's like, I'm just done with you and I don't love you anymore. He still loves them through it all. And the whole point of this is to draw them back into relationship with him. The passage I always think of in that respect is from the book of Amos. Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos. In Amos chapter 4, there's this series of statements beginning in verse 6. I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities and lack of bread in all your places, yet you have not returned to me. I sent discipline, not for the purpose of driving you away, but for the purpose of drawing you back. And so I sent this discipline, but you didn't return. And so what did I do? I sent more discipline. Look at verse 8. So 2 or 3 cities would stagger to get to another to drink water, but it would not be satisfied. Yet you have not returned to me. And so you still didn't come back to me. So what did I have to do? I had to discipline you again. In verse 9, yet you have not returned to me. And then verse 10, yet you have not returned to me. Verse 11, yet you have not returned to me. So all of these things are always for the purpose of God drawing them back into relationship, drawing them back into that community that he wants them to be in with him. And they continually refuse. They get it right for a while sometimes, but eventually they go back to their idolatry, they go back to their sinful ways, and God sends more discipline. And that's the cycle over and over and over again. Well, let's look at Justin.
This I guess parable reminds me a lot of what Jesus, a parable Jesus talks about of the vineyard, and it's the specific parable that I find is funny that verse 12, Mark 12 verse 12, and after Jesus tells the parable, the Pharisees and people were seeking to arrest him because they knew that the parable was about him, and it's the parable of there is a vineyard and God owns a vineyard, and God sent his son and sent his prophets. And so this is a, in this time, the Pharisees, the Jews, this Isaiah 5, they would have read, they would have known, it would have been a part of who they were. They would have had most of it probably memorized. And then Jesus uses that same illustration again, kind of making this allusion back to, Isaiah talked about how there was a vineyard and you have mistreated it. And again, there is a vineyard and you are still mistreating me. And it's just I think that it was a good bridge between Old Testament, things that they would have fully understand and knew, and that Jesus was using this same parabolic imagery about himself and the Pharisees.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. I think it's almost as Jesus saying, here we go again. We've been here before. Here we are again. We're looking at the exact same illustration and making very similar applications from the days of Isaiah all the way, 700 years later to the days of Jesus. So I think you're exactly right. There is we see influences of Isaiah in several parables that Jesus uses, because there's not just one parable about a vineyard. There's a couple. The next section here in Isaiah 5 is a section of woes, verses 5. I think that's supposed to be 8 through 25. Verses 8 through 25 give us the section of woes. Rather than reading the entire entire thing at once, we'll just kind of take it a section at a time here, because it does divide up just nicely. We can look at verses 8 through 10 and kind of look at the first point, and then kind of make our way through it. As long as we don't get too detailed or too bogged down in it, I think I can make it through a list of 6 things and still have time to get to the end. Verse 8 through 10 says, "Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field until there is no more room, so that you have to live alone in the midst of the land. In my ears, the Lord of hosts has sworn, surely many houses shall become desolate, even great and fine ones without occupants. For 10 acres of vineyard will yield only 1 bath of wine, and a homer of seed will yield but an ephah of grain." So we have these woes being pronounced. In the first one, there is no room for God in the pursuit of wealth. And this first section here, it laments that there is no room for God in the pursuit of wealth. In the 8th and 9th centuries BC, which is the time frame that we're looking in that leads right up to this, this time frame was characterized by basically a confiscation of land. The wealthy were gradually just kind of gathering up all the resources, and as a family became poor and weren't able to maintain their land, and they would sell that land, it was supposed to happen, right? It was supposed to revert back to the family that purchased it on the year of Jubilee. And so, but that wasn't taking place. That wasn't happening. And so people were were taking advantage of the fact that their countrymen were not able to provide for themselves, and they would buy up that land and then they wouldn't return it. And so you had this upper class, this upper crust of society that was becoming more and more wealthy, more and more powerful, and they were doing so to the detriment and harm of the people that they were taking things away from. And that, we see that come to a head here in Isaiah as that gets condemned over and over and over again. Now, it's important to note that it's not wealth that is being condemned. Does Isaiah ever say that it's bad to be rich?
No.
That it's bad to have stuff? No, I mean, wealth itself is not condemned.
And it's not money that's evil.
Right, it's not money per se, it's not money itself that is bad, it is the way it's viewed. Abraham was wealthy, and he was one of the great men of the Old Testament. Moses was very wealthy and was very meek, and there were many of the great characters of the Bible were very well off, but it wasn't their wealth that made them great, and it wasn't their wealth that kept them from being great. It was their hearts that made them great. So those who secure wealth unjustly and then who use that wealth without concern for righteousness and justice, these are the ones that are condemned. And so it's not the wealth itself, it's how that wealth is used. So what's going to be the result of those that stockpile all this wealth and that are putting their trust in this wealth? Well, it's going to fail them. Wealth, eventually it will fail. You don't get to take it with you. And even if you get to hang on to it for a long, long time in this life, it doesn't sustain. And so he gives some examples. The 10 acres of a vineyard will yield only 1 bath of wine. That's not a good return. That's pretty miserable. And a homer of seed will yield but an ephah of grain. I don't know what homers and ephahs are, but a homer is more than an ephah. So if you plant a homer and only gain an ephah, that's a bad investment. If you plant a bushel and only gain what's smaller than a bushel? A peck? If you plant a bushel but only get a peck, that's a bad deal, right? So that that's what's going to happen if you put your faith and your trust in the wealth. The next section there, verses 11 and down through verse 17, I believe. Yeah, 11 through 17 will be our next woe. Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them. And their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute, and by wine. They do not pay attention to the deeds of the Lord, nor do they consider the work of his hands. Therefore my people go into exile for their lack of knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure. And Jerusalem's splendor, her multitude, her din of revelry, and the jubilant within her descend into it. So the common man will be humbled, the man of importance abased. The eyes of the proud also will be abased. The Lord of hosts will be exalted in judgment, and the holy God will show himself holy in righteousness. Then the lambs will graze as in their pasture, and strangers will eat in the waste places of the wealthy. So these verses here lament that there is no room for God in the pursuit of pleasure. And this woe exposes those who indulge in luxury without concern for community. There's an interesting kind of juxtaposition here made by those that pursue this pleasure. Their appetite is never filled. Right? As if you're pursuing pleasure and that's constantly what you're pursuing, do you ever get enough pleasure where you sit back and say, "Whew, I'm done"? No, you're constantly looking for the next fun thing, the next joyous thing, the next thing to bring you happiness, whatever, to bring you worth. And so your appetite is never filled. But he contrasts that with Sheol. And what is Sheol?
The grave.
It's the grave. It's death. Death is that thing which truly can never be filled. And so if we're going to match our appetite for pleasure against the appetite of death, who's going to win that battle? Death consumes everything, and it is never filled. There's always room in death for one more thing to die. And so if we are constantly pursuing pleasure, constantly pursuing fun and the next great thing, eventually that's going to end in death, and death is going to win the victory there. And so, trying to trying to out-eat death or out-gain death and just make your life a pursuit of happiness and a pursuit of pleasure, well, death's going to win that battle. Greg?
It kind of looks like there in verse 13 he's predicting the captivity.
Yes.
We're going to go into exile for lack
Yep.
of understanding.
Right. And, Hosea 4 verse 6, also very similar verse, says, my people are destroyed for their lack of knowledge. And, here, think of all the things we've talked about, the contrast between the reality, the potential for what God wanted versus the reality of the way things were. And if the people had only known that God would have provided for them a wonderful life, if only they had understood that, if only they had known, they could have had pleasure, right? Not physical. I'm not talking about fleeting. I'm talking about real,
Genuine.
meaningful joy in this life by living the way that God wanted them to live and pursuing the things that he wanted them to pursue. And so if they had only known, right? Well, why didn't they know?
They didn't seek it.
They didn't really want to know. They wanted to pursue it their own way. And so it was their lack of knowledge about what God had to offer them that caused them to be carried off into exile, taken into captivity. So they were destroyed for their lack of knowledge. I wonder if that's a concern for us. The punishments here in this section fit right hand in hand with the indulgences that they're experiencing, just like the last section where, you're pursuing wealth and God's it's going to fail in the end. Here you were pursuing pleasure and it's going to fail in the end as well. Verses 18 and 19 says, woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood and sin as if with cart ropes, who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work that we may see it, and let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come to pass that we may know it. And so there is no room for God in a cynical lifestyle, which I thought was an interesting way to word this one. This woe uses the metaphor of an animal pulling a cart. Jerusalem is the beast drawing along a cart filled with sin. And it suggests an intentional decision to do wrong. We've been following this path long enough now. How many hundreds of years has Israel at this point inhabited Jerusalem? It's been our city all this time. The temple is here. God's not going to forsake it. We're entrenched in this lifestyle. We're entrenched in this way of living. And yeah, God says this, but he always says that. We're just going to kind of do it our way. And that's a cynical lifestyle, and there's no room for God in that. It's just writing God off and saying, we're just going to do things our own way. And it's worked up to this point. It's gotten us this far. We'll be okay. And so there's just no room for God in that. Jerusalem responds by challenging God to carry out the destruction that Isaiah has announced. The things have continued this way for so long. God keeps saying he's going to destroy. If he's going to do it, let him get to it. That's bold, but that's kind of the attitude that people develop over time if they fail to understand that God is serious about these things. Verse 20, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. There's no room for God in the arrogant use of freedom. There's no room for God in the arrogant use of freedom. This woe reflects a society that had redefined actions based on their own self-interest and not God's justice and righteousness. Such redefinitions led to confusion, moral irregularities, and weakening of cultural foundations. Now we'll just skip this. We'll just skip this one. This one doesn't apply at all. Oh my goodness, this one is USA 2022. Absolutely, a society that redefines what is right and what is wrong. We're just gonna, the things that your parents taught you were wrong, they were wrong, and now we're gonna call those things right. And we're gonna say those things are good and righteous, and That attitude that you have about some things being sinful, that's just mean. And you don't have any right to tell anyone else that they have any sin in their life. And so you need to stop that, because that makes you a bad person for telling them they're sinners. I mean, that's where our society is today. And so, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And when powerful people have the ability to do that, to rewrite what is right and what is wrong, society's in trouble. And that's exactly where Jerusalem was in Isaiah's day. Verse 21 says, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Okay.
You don't know anybody like that, huh?
Well, I don't want to name names.
Oh, we're not doing names. No.
There is number 5 there. There's no room for God among the prideful and the self-sufficient. Jesus dealt with that in his day when he talked about who did the physician come to see? Those who were sick. And so if you're not sick, you don't need a physician, right? And there were people in Jesus' day who did not see themselves as sinners, didn't see themselves as unrighteous, in need of any healing at all. So Jesus said, basically, I don't have anything for you. If that's the way you view yourself, I have nothing to offer you. But for those who understand that they are sick and they are in need of a physician, then Jesus said, I have something for you. I can help you with that. And that's the case of the people in Isaiah's day as well. Remember, the purpose of the parable at the beginning in the first place was to help the people see things from God's perspective. Well, why couldn't they see things from God's perspective in the first place? Why did they need a parable to do that? They needed that because they were wise in their own eyes. They were self-sufficient in and of themselves. They believed they knew exactly who they were and what they were doing. But they didn't understand that they were doing it wrong. And so they needed to have a wake-up call to show them God's perspective. And then verses 22 and 23 says, woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. What an interesting turn of phrase there. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine. You ever know anybody like that? I mean, that's kind of a common thing even today, isn't it? About people that can drink more than anybody else, or that can that are tougher than everybody else, or whatever the case. However you want to measure it, that they're going to establish some standard and say, well, I can do this better than anybody else. But it's really a foolish standard to be really good at. I can hit my thumb with a hammer more times than you can, right? I can stub my toe in the dark more times than you can without crying. That makes me tough, right? I mean, what a foolish thing to say. What a foolish standard to establish for ourselves. And yet a standard like, well, I can get drunker than you can get, or I can drink more than you can and still stand on my feet. What a foolish thing to do. And yet that was where they were at. And so they were establishing these false standards of what was right or what was good, and they were challenging one another in those. So there's no room for God among those who numb themselves in self-medication. I can't be the best at anything worthwhile, so I'm going to establish something foolish, and I'm going to be the best at that. And that's where I'm going to get my self-worth. That's where I'm going to get my value.
I recently saw a T-shirt. Said whiskey goes in and wisdom comes out.
Whiskey goes in and wisdom comes out. I don't think it works that way.
No.
There used to be a bumper sticker back when those used to be more popular, it seems like, than they are now. Bumper sticker that said, "He who dies with the most toys wins." Right? What a foolish standard to establish, that I'm just going to establish. I'm going to be better at you at accumulating stuff, and when I die, I've got more stuff, so I win. Well, probably not. Justin?
It's somewhat funny. Well, maybe not funny is the right word, but it's interesting to see how all of these things that Isaiah and God through Isaiah is saying, woe to these people. And in his case, in Isaiah's case, that's That's what his society was saying.
Uh-huh.
You know, and I think it's the same with ours. You know, this is where point 6, I kind of thought about this of you know, I have some people that I know who take pride in, oh yeah, I'm a hero. I want to be called a hero at drinking.
Yeah.
In our drinking is where it ends there. I want to be a hero at drinking. And then you go back through there, and it's like, if you look at that, these are all of the flipping it around, what the world is saying. These are the good things. These are the things to pursue. You know, wealth at any cost. It's good to pursue pleasure, and you make yourself happy. It's good to pursue, you know, all of these different things that Scripture says that this is woe, stay away from.
Right.
And I think it kind of, at least to me, helps set apart that idea that Jesus and John and Paul talk about of, you know, being friends with the world is enmity with God.
Right.
And this is one of the practical applications of that.
Right.
Isaiah is spelling it out for us right here.
You're exactly right. All of the things on this list, first of all, human nature hasn't changed in, 3,000 years. It's amazing, isn't it, that we can detail for detail on most of these things. We can say, well, I know people who are exactly like that. Or I've struggled with, that one myself or whatever. So the fact that this is still so relevant to us as God's people who are trying to be God's people who are trying to do the right thing, the fact that we look at this and we see merit in studying this and reading it is astounding to me that it's still so relevant. But then, it just hits point for point with us. This is a list of things I need to remember. I need to put this up on my mirror and read it every day.
Years ago, some of you remember Larry Wallace had a car dealership here in town, and he had a friend in Kansas City that kept buying more and more and more dealerships. And Larry had a way of turning the phrase. He finally, I asked him, how much steak can you eat?
Right?
But the point that you made earlier was there is no fulfillment in
Right.
accumulating wealth, and we see that over and over again.
Yeah, and so we are, all of this is for the purpose of opening their eyes so that they can see the futility of what they're pursuing, and they can see the wisdom in pursuing what God wants for them. If they could exchange all of this for God's vision of what a good society would be, then they would be so much better off. But they think they have the vision of what the society should be. Okay. Let's look at the last section here of verses 26 through 30. And actually, we'll go back. We haven't read verse 24. Verses 24 and 25 kind of conclude that section of the woes with a therefore. So the therefore, as the tongue of fire consumes stubble and dry grass collapses into the flame, so their root will become like rot and their blossom blow away as dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. On this account, the anger of the Lord is burned against his people, and he has stretched out his hand against them and struck them down. The mountains quaked, and their corpses lay like refuse in the middle of the streets, for all his anger is not spent, but his hand is still stretched out. And so there is an element, not just of, there is an element of punishment here. There's an element of dealing with the fact that all of this angers God. And it's a righteous anger. It's a righteous wrath that God experiences when his people don't do what he is supposed to do. As a righteous and innocent husband, it is okay for a righteous and innocent husband to feel jealousy when his wife commits adultery. And so if the husband is righteous, if he is innocent of any wrongdoing and his wife steps out on him, jealousy is an appropriate response to that. And God here is jealous of the affection that the people are giving to the idols, to their sins, that should be directed at him. And so it is okay that God feels this way, because it is a righteous anger and jealousy. So verses 26 through 30, is kind of in a poetic form, and it talks about this coming destruction. So it says, and he will lift up a standard to the distant nations and will whistle for it from the ends of the earth. And behold, it will come with speed swiftly. No one in it is weary or stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps, nor is the belt at its waist undone, nor its sandals strap broken. Its arrows are sharp, and all its bows are bent. The hoofs of its horses seem like flint, and its chariot wheels like a whirlwind. Its roaring is like a lioness, and it roars like young lions. It growls as it seizes the prey, and carries it off with no one to deliver it. And it shall growl over it in that day like the roaring of the sea. If one looks to the land, behold, there is darkness and distress. Even the light is darkened by its clouds. So if you went through if you were keeping track as we read through that, there are 23 qualities of the army that God is sending to punish Jerusalem. And some of them are kind of subtle little statements. Some of them are kind of very, very bold statements. The idea of lifting up its standard or its flag, that's maybe doesn't have as much bearing or meaning for us as something like saying like its chariot wheels are like the whirlwind. I mean, that paints kind of a more, a more vicious imagery for us. But just the idea that it's, it's standards that God has whistled for it, He's called it forth, and it's coming. It's assured.
A military company is recognized by their flag.
Yeah, and absolutely, and the standard is an important thing, and it talked about in the days of the Roman infantry, the Roman standard, never fell in battle or whatever, and even today, the idea of carrying your flag into battle and the flag can't touch the ground. You're not if the one carrying the standard is stricken or wounded, the next person in line takes that standard because we're not going to let that flag touch the ground, and so it symbolizes and rallies the troops. But this army that is coming, no one is weary, no one stumbles, they don't slumber or sleep. Their belt is not undone, they're ready to go at all times. Their bow is bent, it means it's ready to fire. It's not unstrung, it's strung and ready to go. And all those things, just that imagery of this army that has it put together. It's ready to go. It's ready to go into battle, and you're not going to defeat this army that's coming on. The army is compared in a couple of graphic ways to a lion, the king of beasts, the king of the jungle, and I don't want to face a lion. I have a hard enough time with a house cat that doesn't want to go in the kennel or something, but I don't want to face a lion for sure. And that would be a terrible imagery to consider, that you had an army of lions coming after you. This passage provides additional information on the nature of God's destruction and the violence that is coming. This is not going to be think of when Daniel was in Babylon and the Medo-Persian Empire came and took over. There was the writing on the wall, "Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin," or whatever. And later that night, what happened? There was a bloodless coup, basically. They came in and killed the king, but everybody else lived. That's not this. This is not going to be a bloodless coup. There's going to be death and destruction and violence. And it's been brought on because of their rejection and repudiation of the society that God tried to create, that He wanted to create. And so think about for a moment the reason that God has to why does God have to destroy that society that they've created for themselves?
Because He can't dwell with them.
Because He can't live with it, because He can't live in the presence of sin. But if they have done the opposite of what He asked them to do, and you have this rich upper crust of society, these rich and powerful people who have established this control over the whole region, and they look at what they've done and they think, well, we didn't have to do it God's way, we did it our way, and look how we're living. Is that okay for God to let that go? No. God has to repudiate that. He has to say, that's not the society I told you I wanted to build. You didn't do it the way I wanted you to do it, and it's not going to stand.
I think just maybe the flip of that is God has to show His love to the faithful,
Mm-hmm.
and just like parents or any other thing, you have to protect the ones that did do what you want, because
Right.
there is a remnant.
There are those who were,
that He has to
Yeah.
protect them for his word to mean.
yeah, in the days of Elijah, there were 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal, even though he thought he was alone. And undoubtedly, there were faithful in Jerusalem in this day as well. There were those who were faithful. Isaiah representing a class of people that would have been faithful. But and so he does have to protect the faithful as well as repudiate those who are unfaithful. Well, let's move into this section, continuities. How do we see these things playing out in relevant ways, either from a New Testament standpoint or from a modern day standpoint? So a couple of questions to consider. We've already kind of addressed this one. What similarities do you see in Isaiah's parable of the vineyard and parables that Jesus used? Well, Justin already mentioned the one about he sent, there was the vineyard owner who sent his servants to harvest the crop, to take in the harvest, and the ones who were there working killed the servants, and then he sent a son, and surely they will listen to my son, right? Nope, they killed him too and tried to take over what he had, what was rightfully his. And so there's that one. Seems like there's another one that has to do with the vineyard as well that at this moment has escaped me.
Matthew?
I think that one is Matthew 24 maybe that we were just mentioning. 21. I was close.
Matthew 20, laborers in the vineyard.
Parable of the landowners at the end of Matthew 21.
The laborers in the vineyard.
The labors in the vineyard is at the beginning of verse 20. Yeah. So there's one about a vineyard that where they hire some of them in the morning and some of them in the, a few hours later, and finally some at the 11th hour, and they all get paid the same. And so that does take place in a vineyard. We'll count it.
Well, this isn't to do with the parable, but I was thinking about God destroying his people for lack of knowledge, and you just said, I wonder if that has relevance for us. Well, I was trying to think of the scripture, and I found it in Acts 17. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent.
Which is basically what Isaiah was calling them to in that day, calling them to repent.
Can still be destroyed for lack
Yeah.
of knowledge of God.
Yep.
It's not good. The ignorance is not bliss.
Yeah. You're exactly right. How does God's finish of our ideal life differ? That's not a good question. How does God's view, I think, of our ideal life, I don't know how I got the word finish. How does God's view of our ideal life differ from the lives that we live? I mean, that's what we've been talking about through these first 5 chapters. God's view of an ideal life for them versus what they lived. How does that relate for us? What is God's ideal view of life for us?
In John 15, Jesus talks about being the true vine, and if we remain in Him, that we can be fruitful. And so I think his idea of what we need to be, and we talked about this in class too, is this last Sunday was that we are fruitful.
Yep.
That we produce fruit for Him, and we talked about this some Sunday afternoon too. But that our ideal life is doing works of faith, that exhibit the works that God's prepared for us.
Right. Yeah. Works of faith, fruit of the Spirit. Yeah. Okay. And then,
He promises an abundant life.
okay, we're promised an abundant life. John chapter 10. I've come that they might have life and that they might have it with abundance. So he doesn't, which consider that in the context of Isaiah. The people that are being called out in Isaiah were those people that by all physical measurements, were living an abundant life. And yet it wasn't the life God had called them to. And so when Jesus tells us that, he calls us to live an abundant life, it's not an abundant life in physical terms, it's an abundant life in spiritual terms. And so the abundance that God offers is not the abundance that the world offers, and it's not the abundance that we often seek for ourselves. It's a different abundance. It's a different fulfillment. And
Well, how David says, my cup runneth over.
yeah, and Jesus told the woman at the well, if you had asked me, I would have given you water that would spring up within you and become a well, that never ran out. And she was thinking in physical terms, well, I'd like to drink that water. I'd never have to draw water from the well again. Well, no, that's not what I mean. I'm not talking physically. I'm talking spiritually. And so Jesus offers us an abundant life. It's an ideal life. And it doesn't have anything to do with physical stuff. It has to do with spiritual blessings. And, storing up for yourselves treasures in heaven rather than treasures on the earth. All kinds of things like that. So, Justin.
One of the things I was thinking about with this question, looking back at our 6 woes, that on the sheet it says, laments that there is no room for God. And I think that kind of, at least to me, sums up one of the biggest applications of this lesson, is that when there's no room for God, I am not living the ideal life. So the ideal life has room for God. So
Yeah.
where can I add in God?
Yeah.
And where am I shoving him to the side and not
Yeah.
having enough room for him? Is it one of
Yeah.
these categories of things we've talked about today, and how can I pursue God more based on what I know of the woes that we have studied?
Yeah. I think that's reflected in the words of John the Baptist at the end of, I think, John chapter 3, when he says, he must increase and I must decrease, which he was talking about his fame and the word of his name and popularity and those kind of things. But in a very real sense, the closer we draw to God, he must increase and I must decrease. Everything about me needs to be minimized and everything about him needs to be maximized. And that's where the ideal life comes from.
Well, John came to prepare the way for Jesus.
Yes.
And so it was, he had to
Yeah.
understand and make known that he had to decrease.
Right. What similarities do we see with the woes of Isaiah 5 and the lives of people today? We kind of hit on a lot of those already and mixed that discussion in, I think, with some of the other conversation. And we're over time. So next week, Isaiah chapter 6, one of my favorite chapters in Isaiah. I love the vision that Isaiah has at the beginning of the chapter and how that plays out in the first few verses. So good stuff.